Designer clothes, expensive watches, jet skis, speedboats. From the outside, they looked like a group of young men obsessed with showing off their money. But behind the image was something far darker. Friends were being murdered, homes were being attacked, teenagers were being pulled into gangland feuds, and eventually Gardaí would uncover machine guns, hundreds of rounds of ammunition, huge quantities of drugs, and even a monkey locked inside a cage. At the center of it all was a man the public knew only as Mr. Flashy. But as the bodies began to pile up, people around his gang started turning against each other. And incredibly, one of the biggest pieces of evidence that would eventually help bring him down would be discovered almost by accident. This is the story of the Gucci Gang, and how one of Dublin's most notorious young criminal networks began to tear itself apart.
He had associations with senior members of the Kinahan crime group based in Finglas. Because of the strict, defamation laws in Ireland, he couldn't be named because he didn't have relevant previous convictions. So because of his, penchant for designer clothes, for the finer things in life, this nickname Mr. Flashy came around, and certainly the gang he associated and directed also shared the love for designer clothing, and they were known as the Gucci Gang.
Long before Dublin knew him as Mr. Flashy, his real name was Glen Ward. Ward was born in Ballymun in North Dublin in 1993, before his family later moved to Finglas. He was the third of 6 siblings, and before becoming one of the most recognizable figures in Dublin's criminal underworld, Ward trained as a mechanic. But by his early 20s, his life was moving in a very different direction. Because Ward didn't create the criminal world he was about to enter, it was already there. One of the established criminals operating around Finglas was Trevor Byrne. Byrne had built a serious reputation in Dublin's underworld. But by 2016, Byrne had left Ireland, and in his absence, space opened for somebody younger. And by 2016, Gardaí believed Glen Ward had begun taking control of the Finglas criminal organisation previously associated with Byrne. Ward was still only in his early 20s, but the group developing around him already had something every criminal organisation needs: a base. On Ratuath Drive in Finglas stood a property that became closely associated with Ward's organisation. The house had effectively been taken over through a practice commonly known as cuckooing, where criminals take control of another person's property and use it for their own activities. It became heavily associated with drug dealing. CCTV monitored the surrounding area, and Gardaí knew exactly where it was. Between March 2016 and July 2020, officers would search the property 16 separate times. Yet the organisation continued operating, and drugs were at the centre of it. But the young criminals surrounding Ward became known for something else as well: the way they displayed money. Designer clothes, expensive watches, jewellery, cars, motorbikes. Status wasn't something to keep hidden, it was something to show. And eventually, that image created 2 names that would follow the group for years: the Gucci Gang and Mr. Flashy. Neither name had been chosen by the gang themselves. They were labels created around the image the group projected. The image came first, the name followed. And Ward wasn't operating alone. Around him were men whose names would repeatedly appear as the story became more violent. His younger brother Eric O'Driscoll would become another important figure. There was Zach Parker, Ward's friend and another man linked to the gang. Others moved around the wider network. Some were members, some were associates, and some connected Ward's world to criminal organisations operating far beyond Finglas. Because while Ward was establishing himself in North Dublin, Ireland was already being consumed by something much bigger: the Kinahan-Hutch feud. And soon, men linked to the criminal world around Ward would become caught directly inside it.
Now a familial bond between the Gucci Gang and the Kinahan organisation have featured in Criminal Assets Bureau affidavits, which give an insight into a troubled period of restructure in both groups.
One of Ward's close associates was convicted drug dealer Ian O'Hear. O'Hear had connections into the wider Kinahan network, including through senior figures associated with the organisation. That gave Ward's circle a route into a criminal world far more powerful than the streets of Finglas. But those links weren't limited to drugs. Some younger criminals around Ward's wider circle became involved in violence connected directly to the Kinahan-Hutch feud. One of them was Cowlan Smith,
29-year-old Caelan Smith, who is a father of 3 from Quillan Court, Dunor in County Meath, shot James Gately 5 times on May the 10th, 2017. He'll be sentenced next month.
On May 10th, 2017, James Margot Gately travelled to a petrol station near Dublin Airport. Smith had been watching him. He followed Gately there, then opened fire. Gately was shot 5 times. Somehow, he survived. Years later, the Special Criminal Court convicted Smith of attempting to murder him. In February 2021, Smith was sentenced to 20 years in prison. But by the time that shooting happened, Ward himself was already attracting dangerous attention. In 2017, Gardaí formally warned him that they believed his life was under threat. He was only 24. The public image projected wealth and confidence. Behind it, Ward already knew somebody might be trying to kill him. Then another Kinahan-related murder conspiracy developed. This time, the intended target was Patrick "Patsy" Hutch. Among the men involved were Mark Kappa and Mohammed Smew. During early 2018, reconnaissance was carried out as part of preparations for the proposed attack. Locations were checked, movements were studied, but there was something the men involved did not know. Gardaí were watching, and hidden inside that surveillance was one detail that exposed how different reality could be from the image surrounding organised crime. During one reconnaissance trip, Kappa needed Smew to lend him €50, a plot connected to one of Ireland's most notorious criminal organisations, and one of the men involved couldn't cover €50 himself. The proposed murder never happened. Kappa withdrew from the plan. The Garda surveillance operation helped dismantle the conspiracy, and the men involved were later imprisoned for offences connected to it. But Ward's connection to the Kinahan world went further than individual murder plots. At the time, Ward controlled a large, unified drugs gang in Finglas. The organisation was being supplied with drugs by the Kinahan network. That relationship gave Ward status among the men around him. It also created fear. Being connected to something bigger strengthened his position. But when Garda operations against the Kinahan organisation forced much of its Irish operation to scale back, that relationship changed. The Kinahan stopped supplying the Finglas gang, and once that happened, the power dynamic inside Ward's organisation became less stable. It wouldn't collapse immediately. First, the men around Ward would begin disappearing for another reason. They were being murdered. On the 17th of January 2019, 23-year-old Zach Parker was shot dead outside a gym in Swords, North Dublin. Parker wasn't some distant criminal who happened to cross paths with Ward. He was Ward's friend, and Garda evidence would later identify him as a fellow member of the gang. Investigators immediately began examining why he had been killed. One line of inquiry centered on a suspected drug debt. According to Garda intelligence, Parker had received drugs on credit before those drugs were lost during a Garda seizure. The drugs were gone, but the debt remained. Whether that debt ultimately caused Parker's murder was never established in court. But Parker's death immediately led Gardaí somewhere else. The following day, officers searched a storage facility Parker had rented in Balbriggan. While Gardaí were there, 3 men arrived. Among them were Glen Ward and Seán Little. The investigation also exposed some of the expensive possessions connected with this world. 2 jet skis had been purchased for approximately €32,000. A speedboat cost another €8,000. Much of the money had been paid in cash. In one transaction involving the jet skis, small denomination notes were handed over inside a plastic bag. At the time, those possessions fitted perfectly with the image surrounding the Gucci gang. Years later, some of those assets would end up in the High Court. But before the courts began examining where the money came from, Gardaí made another discovery. And this one involved guns, drugs, and something nobody would have expected.
Well, a lot of the time we have synchronised searches where we'll have a few of the same gang members being targeted by ourselves on warrants. So what will happen is we'll synchronise it that the doors all go in at the exact same time so that nobody then can give the other person the biddy that we're around.
In April 2019, Gardaí carried out a major operation targeting criminals around Finglas and Blanchardstown. They recovered a machine pistol, a .357 Magnum revolver, a machine gun fitted with a silencer, around 300 rounds of ammunition, approximately €100,000 worth of cocaine, approximately €30,000 worth of cannabis, and about €3,000 worth of stolen clothing. Then officers found something completely out of place, a small marmoset monkey. It was taken into Garda possession on animal welfare grounds. The monkey was bizarre. The rest of the seizure wasn't. And only days later, another violent dispute erupted nearby. On April 10, 2019, Kenneth Fitzsimons was standing at a bus stop close to Finglas Garda station. Martin Cunningham approached him. Cunningham was carrying a machete. Then he attacked. Fitzsimons was knocked to the ground and struck repeatedly. He suffered deep wounds to his neck, arms, legs, and torso. Some of the wounds to his torso exposed his ribs. He required 4 litres of blood during emergency treatment. But Fitzsimons managed to escape. He ran into Finglas Garda station, where officers found him bleeding heavily. He survived. Cunningham was initially charged with attempted murder. That charge was later dropped after he pleaded guilty to assault causing harm and producing the machete. The court imposed a 4-year sentence. The final 12 months were suspended. 3 years of immediate custody. But even that level of violence would soon be overshadowed. Because the following month, 3 men connected through the same criminal landscape would be murdered within roughly 1 week.
The area that the body was found is on the link road between Junction 5, M1 and Walshtown in an area known as Rowan's Little.
On the 21st of May 2019, Seán Little was lured to an isolated area near the M1. He was shot repeatedly. His body was discovered near his burning car. According to Garda intelligence, Little had himself been attempting to arrange the murder of another man. Investigators believed he had been double-crossed. Somebody else had apparently paid more. That account was Garda intelligence, but one serious dispute involving Little was already known: Jordan Davis. And what made it unusual was that Davis wasn't simply another rival. He had been Little's friend, a close one. After Little was murdered, Davis even posted a tribute to him online. But behind that friendship, something had gone badly wrong. By late 2018, money had become a serious source of tension. Sandra Davis later told a court that Seán Little and another man came to her home looking for Jordan. Little did most of the talking. The conversation was about money Jordan owed. Then the tone changed. According to Sandra, Little threatened that her son would be shot. That completely changes the picture, because these weren't 2 men who had always been enemies. They had been close, they knew each other, and somewhere along the way, that relationship had deteriorated badly enough for threats of murder to enter the conversation. Prosecutors later established that the amount involved was around €70,000. Jordan Davis was under serious financial pressure, and Seán Little had already threatened his life. Then Little was murdered. Less than 24 hours later, on the 22nd of May 2019, Jordan Davis was walking through Darndale. He was pushing his 4-month-old son in a buggy. A gunman had been looking for him. When Davis was found, he was shot 3 times. He died. His baby was unharmed. Unlike many of the murders surrounding this world, Davis's killing eventually resulted in a conviction. Wayne Cooney was found guilty of murdering him. He received a life sentence. But another man had already been pulled into the Garda investigation: Hamid Sanambar. Gardaí suspected Sanambar had played a role in the circumstances surrounding Davis's murder. 6 days after Davis was killed, Sanambar was outside the home of Seán Little's family. He was shot dead in a laneway beside the property. Little, Davis, Sanambar, 3 killings in roughly 1 week. And revenge continued spreading outward. Months later, Seán Little's father Stephen Little was intercepted by Gardaí alongside Edward McDonnell. The prosecution case was that the men were equipped in circumstances connected with preparations for another Gangland shooting. That potential attack was disrupted. Both men were later imprisoned, but 2019 still wasn't finished. On the 24th of November, 22-year-old Ian Boylan was shot dead in Coolock. Boylan had already received Garda warnings that his life was in danger. Investigators examined whether his social media activity following Little's murder had helped make him a target, and that exposed something that was becoming increasingly important. Reputation was moving online. An insult didn't disappear when an argument ended. It could be captured, shared, forwarded, seen instantly by everyone involved. For young criminals obsessed with status, social media was becoming part of the conflict itself. That mattered, because several years later, a phone would become one of the most damaging pieces of evidence Gardaí ever obtained against Glen Ward.
By 2019, there was 5 murders in the Coolock area, and many of those murders are associated with this particular gang.
By July 2020, Gardaí had searched the Ruttawath Drive property 16 times since March 2016. The base was known, the gang was known, yet the organisation had continued operating. Then in March 2021, Gardaí carried out another drugs operation. Ward was among those arrested following the seizure of approximately €60,000 worth of cocaine in Temple Bar. He was subsequently released, but the bigger problem developing around him wasn't another arrest. It was the organisation itself, and a group that had once operated together began breaking apart. One of the men emerging on the other side was James Whelan. Whelan had been involved in the Finglas drugs trade since his teenage years. While still a young man, he had accumulated more than 50 convictions, including drug offences. And by 2022, he had become a leading figure in the faction that had broken away from Ward's main group. These weren't strangers suddenly entering a feud. They had once operated within the same criminal organisation. They knew each other. They knew where people lived. They knew their families. They knew their routines, and that made what was coming deeply personal. But before the feud exploded, Ward made a mistake of his own. On New Year's Day 2022, Glen Ward was at a gathering inside a house in Finglas. There was a weapon there, a .223 caliber Remington AR-15 semi-automatic rifle. Ward took the rifle, pointed it upwards, and fired once. He then handed it to his younger brother, Eric O'Driscoll. O'Driscoll fired 3 rounds. A number of young people were present, and somebody filmed it. The recording remained on a mobile phone. At that moment, nobody involved could have known how important that recording would eventually become, because Gardaí didn't have the phone, not yet. Then, in early February 2022, the feud inside the Finglas drugs organisation escalated dramatically. Members of the faction linked to James Whelan stole an expensive watch from somebody connected to the rival side. Simply taking the watch wasn't enough. Photographs of it were circulated through messaging apps and social media. The purpose was to taunt the other group. Humiliation had become part of the feud, and the retaliation spread quickly. Beatings, drive-by shootings, petrol bombs, attacks on homes. The organisation that had once operated together was now attacking itself. Then, on February 10th, Gardaí searched a property in Finglas. They recovered the same AR-15 Ward and O'Driscoll had fired on New Year's Day. Alongside it was a military-grade submachine gun and ammunition. Gardaí now had the rifle, but they still didn't have the recording showing Ward and O'Driscoll firing it. Meanwhile, the feud continued. And in the early hours of the 3rd of April 2022, James Whelan entered Deanstown. Gardaí believed he had gone there intending to carry out an arson attack against rivals following earlier shootings at houses. But Whelan was spotted. He ran. He was chased through the estate. Then he was shot. Whelan was 29 years old, a father of 1, and he became the first person killed in the new Finglas feud. Once somebody had been murdered, the conflict changed. Whelan's murder intensified the feud. On the 21st of May 2022, at around 2:30 in the morning, His mother's home on Barnamore Crescent was firebombed. The front of the property was gutted. Fire and smoke spread through the house. A Lexus taxi and a van parked outside were badly damaged. Those inside escaped without reported injury, but the attack immediately produced retaliation. Later that same day, 2 more houses were targeted. Those properties were occupied by people with no involvement in crime. The feud was beginning to put people outside the criminal world in danger. By late May, Gardaí had linked approximately 70 separate incidents to the conflict. Then, in June 2022, the violence came directly back towards Glen Ward. Shots were fired at a taxi on Tolka Valley Road when Ward had been travelling. Ward escaped. When Gardaí searched the vehicle, they found a mobile phone. They also found a bank card in Eric O'Driscoll's name. Investigators were later able to connect the phone to O'Driscoll, and when Garda analysts examined what was stored inside, they found the New Year's Day recording. The AR-15, Glen Ward firing it, Eric O'Driscoll firing it. Gardaí had recovered the weapon 4 months earlier. Now they could connect 2 men directly to it. Somebody had tried to shoot Ward. Instead, the aftermath had delivered Gardaí evidence of a completely different crime.
When their phones or devices were seized, they were able to see that this guy was hands-off and directing stuff which the Gardaí are fairly satisfied was due to head from Dublin into the west of Ireland, probably Sligo or somewhere like that.
The firearms investigation was now moving towards Ward and his brother, but neither man went immediately to prison, and life on the streets continued. On 9th August 2022, Ward and O'Driscoll became involved in an altercation on Cardiff's Bridge Road in Finglas West. Both men would later plead guilty to violent disorder. Both also pleaded guilty to producing a bicycle saddle during the confrontation. The court would later hear that the dispute had not been instigated by the brothers. Then, on November 17th, O'Driscoll became involved in another incident. He was on bail. Gardaí received reports of a motorcycle being driven dangerously. When officers tried to stop him, O'Driscoll fled. A Garda helicopter became involved in the pursuit. Footage later shown in court captured him mounting a curb and coming close to people collecting children from school. Eventually, O'Driscoll abandoned the motorcycle and ran through gardens. Armed Gardaí caught him. But the consequences of that incident would not come immediately, and O'Driscoll was back on the streets before the end of 2022. Then came December. Ward and O'Driscoll went to Finglas Garda Station to sign on as part of their bail conditions. As they left, they were targeted. Shots were fired. Ward escaped without injury, but Eric didn't. He was shot in the buttocks and wounded. Once again, somebody had tried to get close enough to kill the brothers. And less than a year after their own gang had fractured, the violence had reached them directly. By that point, the criminal landscape around Ward had changed dramatically. But another former connection was moving on to an entirely different side. Tristan Sherry. Sherry had previously been associated with the Gucci gang before splitting from it and aligning himself with a rival criminal group. And on Christmas Eve 2023, he walked into a crowded restaurant carrying a gun.
The family of Tristan Sherry said today their lives will never be the same again following his murder here in Brown's Steakhouse on Christmas Eve 2023.
It was the 24th of December, 2023. Families and friends were gathered inside Brown's Steakhouse in Blanchardstown. Among them was 48-year-old Jason Hennessy Sr. Hennessy was not some random target. He was a significant figure in a West Dublin criminal faction that had been involved in a long-running dispute with criminals connected to the Gucci gang. And just before 8 p.m, 2 masked gunmen entered the restaurant. One of them was Tristan Sherry. A second gunman went in with him. That man escaped from the restaurant, and Gardaí later investigated a suspect with significant links to the Gucci gang, a man suspected of sourcing weapons for the gang and involvement in its drugs operation. So, whatever Sherry's exact position within the criminal landscape had become by Christmas 2023, the attack still had a direct connection back into the wider Gucci gang network, and the target on the other side was Jason Hennessy Sr. Inside the restaurant, Sherry confronted Hennessy. Shots were fired. Hennessy was struck in the neck and upper body, but the attack immediately began to unravel. Sherry was overpowered, disarmed, and people inside the restaurant turned on him. He was kicked, stamped on, struck with chairs and other objects, and stabbed repeatedly. The later court case established that Sherry suffered extensive blunt force and sharp force injuries. He was also shot once in the shoulder during the melee, but that gunshot caused only superficial injuries and did not cause his death. His fatal injuries came from the sustained beating and stabbing. The second gunman escaped. Sherry did not. He was taken to Connolly Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. Jason Hennessy Sr. initially survived the shooting, but his injuries were catastrophic. On January 4th, 2024, he died. 2 men had entered the restaurant intending to carry out a shooting. One escaped. One was killed inside, and their target died 11 days later. And while Gardaí began investigating 2 deaths from the Christmas Eve attack, another investigation was already closing in on Glen Ward. Just over a week after Jason Hennessy Sr. died, Ward and his younger brother would appear in court over the AR-15.
And we were saying at the outset about Glen Ward, who was kind of the most prominent of these guys, the Finglas lad, and he has his brother is also serving a sentence. That's in relation to firearms charges.
For years, newspapers had referred to a North Dublin gang leader only as Mr. Flashy. In 2025, High Court evidence publicly identified the man behind the nickname, Glen Ward. And on 21st March 2025, Ward appeared before the Special Criminal Court. He pleaded guilty to possessing the .223 caliber Remington AR-15 in circumstances giving rise to a reasonable inference that he did not have it for a lawful purpose. Eric O'Driscoll had already pleaded guilty to possession of the same weapon. On April 7th, 2025, O'Driscoll was sentenced. 6 years. The final 12 months suspended. 5 years to serve. 3 weeks later, on April 28th, it was Ward's turn. The Special Criminal Court sentenced him to 6 years and 3 months. The final 9 months were suspended. 5 years and 6 months to serve. The mistake made at a house gathering more than 3 years earlier had finally caught up with both brothers. But Ward and O'Driscoll still had another court case waiting. On the 21st of May 2025, they returned to court over the Cardiff's Bridge Road altercation. Ward received an 18-month sentence for violent disorder and producing the bicycle saddle. The sentence was fully suspended. O'Driscoll received 2 years. The final 18 months were suspended. 6 months remained to be served consecutively. The court also sentenced O'Driscoll for the dangerous motorcycle incident from November 2022 and banned him from driving for 10 years. The brothers who had once been photographed and filmed around the criminal world of Finglas were now serving prison sentences.
The leader of a North Dublin organised crime group known as the Gucci Gang was yesterday jailed for 5.5 years on firearms offences. Glen Ward, known in Finglas as Mr. Flashy, will now join his younger brother Eric O'Driscoll in prison.
From the outside, it could have looked like the story was over. But taking Ward off the streets did not remove the reason the organisation had existed in the first place. The drugs market was still there, and control of it was still worth money. Ward's imprisonment changed the balance inside the criminal world around Finglas. The old structure had already broken apart. Now other factions were competing for position. And only days after Ward received his firearms sentence, that violence escalated in an extraordinary way. On the night of the 4th of May 2025, a drone was flown over Finglas. Hanging underneath it was a viable improvised explosive device. Gardaí believed the bomb was intended for a criminal target connected to the ongoing violence around the local drugs trade. But the drone never reached him. Instead, shortly before 11 p.m, it crashed into the garden of an innocent family's home in Glentees Park. The device failed to explode. Army bomb disposal specialists were called to the scene and rendered it safe. Nobody in that house was the intended target, but an explosive device connected to a criminal feud had still landed in their garden. Ward was in prison, yet the violence in Finglas had not disappeared. It had evolved. And while different factions fought for position, another man connected to the old Gucci Gang network had become increasingly important: Mark Salmon. Salmon had spent years operating much further from the spotlight than Ward. He was connected to the wider Gucci gang network and had been associated with murdered gang members Zach Parker and Seán Little. As other figures were killed, imprisoned or removed from the streets, Seán became increasingly significant within the drugs operation that remained. And eventually, investigators uncovered the scale of what he was involved in. By 2026, prosecutors had established a serious drugs and intimidation operation built around enormous debts. One debt was approximately €88,600. Another family was being pursued over approximately €157,000. Threats were made, relatives were targeted, and violence was used to enforce payment. Seán had originally faced broader allegations, including directing a criminal organization. But that was not what he was ultimately convicted of. He pleaded guilty to offenses including possession of cocaine, organizing an attack on the family home of a drug addict, threats and possession of criminal proceeds. On the 15th of June 2026, the Special Criminal Court sentenced Mark Seán to 10 years in prison. The Gucci gang did not simply disappear the moment its most recognizable leader went to prison. Some members were dead. Others were imprisoned. New factions had formed. Different criminals moved into positions of influence. But underneath all of it, the same thing remained. The drugs market. That was what had funded the organization. That was what had given men like Ward power. And once Ward was gone, other people still wanted control of it. It was the end of one version of it. One generation had been removed, but the business underneath it survived. And that leaves one final question. Did authorities dismantle the Gucci gang? Or did the criminal world around it simply change shape?